Shalom from Jerusalem. This is TV7's Editor's Note. I'm Jonathan Hessen, and with me in today's edition is Brigadier General in Reserve, Yaron Rosen, formerly the IDF Chief of Cyber Staff, Israel Air Force Commander, a fighter pilot, and a good friend, among others. We are deeply appreciative of you making the way from the center here. Yaron?
Good to be here, Jonathan.
It's always good to be in the capital.
Yep, always good.
Anyways, I'd like to seize this opportunity to kind of talk about Israel's strategic landscape. It has so many complexities since October 7th of 2023. All of the problems that existed just boiled over, and really we were able to see the boiling over from the Gaza Strip, from Lebanon, from Syria, from Iran, naturally, but also from Yemen, and that is the kinetic aspect of things, not to forget Iraq, of course. Beyond that, we had the various Eastern triggered and funded for much of those activities, the various protests around the world, be they in the United States, in European capitals and cities around the continent, in the Middle East, Egypt to a lesser degree, Jordan to a broader degree. We saw the protests coming out of Australia, South Africa. All of that, it basically brought up much of what was already happening, but in a very low-key aspect. To what degree did this, in your opinion, as somebody who travels extensively, really raise concerns in the minds of various leaders in Western civilization, and not only leaders, also the general populations?
The world is an interesting place. When power is reflected in the right way, you gain stability. When power is reflected in the wrong way or weakness, things start moving. That's the reality. That's the world we live in. That's how the whole global geopolitics works. And I think what we saw is just a great example of that on many levels, regional level and the global level. The United States is by far the strongest global power. But even the strongest global power, if it reflects power in the wrong way, the last administration, it sort of let all these forces sort of raise their head and say, hey, maybe we can do these things and get away with it. Mm-hmm. And it creeps in on so many levels. And I think we sort of saw the signs coming, and the outcomes that we're seeing until this day are basically connected to that. So it's sort of, being the world's police, whether you like it or not. It's not a bad thing to be the world's police, because the United States flourishes as the world's biggest economy. The demand for goods, for manufacturing, it is what makes the United States and the world turn around. Someone buys something somewhere around the world, someone is, developing it, building it, manufacturing it. Ships are moving from left to right over the seas, getting people what they, ordered yesterday in the same day. Mm. That's how the world moves around. And I think what we saw in the last few years is how much the world order is sensitive to a strategy which does not reflect control. It doesn't have to be, like using power, conquering, things like that. We're not talking about that. On the regional level, in Israel's neighborhood, that's exactly what you see. On the global level, it's a little bit different, right? You see China, the Southeast and East China Sea, and you understand what happens when the United States sort of doesn't reflect very strong power in that region, even though it's deployed in, more than any other global power. No one has such global power, such as the United States. So I think basically that's what we're seeing. And now in many levels, we're seeing how it plays. Okay, so, when you talk about the forms of national power, you have three forms of national power. You have the economy, you have the statecraft or diplomatic, how a state interacts, every nation interacts with the global community, and you have the military power or the security apparatus that is responsible for reflecting power that is used here and there in order to gain whatever ends that any given state wants to achieve. And I think when the United States, I think what the last administration did, and now is changing with the new administration, I think President Trump is sort of recalibrating all forms of national power of the United States. And I think Israel, in the region that we are in, Israel is a regional power. It's not a global power. But I think that the interaction between Israel's national forms of power and the United States forms of global power, the interaction between them is super interesting because Israel has very strong forms of reflecting power in the region. And the interaction between our two nations creates something that is, from an ROI perspective, I'll be very blunt, is very important.
ROI for those.
The return on investment.
Return on investment.
Yeah, let's be very transactional for a second, okay? What do I get out of it? Well, I think Israel, in a sense, in a very deep sense, is one of the most important assets, sort of an anvil to build upon, reflecting the United States forms of national power. Again, whether they are economic, diplomatic, or military. All three forms are somehow, Israel plays as a spring to the region, and it is very important for the United States. I'll give you one example, and I'm an airman, so I don't want to give I'll actually use air and naval just to show how this is important. Russia has a naval base and an air force base in Syria. It reflects power through Syria. It leased it for 100 years or so, and it doesn't matter if it's the old administration or the new administration. It's Russia. They are reflecting power through that. So they have the Crimea, but they still have to go through Turkey in order which is NATO, to go out to the Mediterranean.
The Straits of Bosphorus.
The Straits of Bosphorus. But now, not now, a long time ago, they have Tartus and Khamimim. Naval assets and Air Force base. What does the United States have? So the United States has the base on the south part of Syria, Jordan, Syria. That's the enclave, the United States area of operations.
Al-Tanf.
Exactly.
In
You have
Syria, and then the T-22 tower in Jordan.
Correct. And you have Qatar,
Mm-hmm.
okay, CENTCOM assets, which are very sensitive to the Iranian area of operations. You have the Saudi area of operations, the influence there, and you have Israel.
And Bahrain.
But Bahrain and Qatar, just from a geostrategic point of view, they're the same place.
Right.
Okay. So what does the United States have on the western flank? Okay. It has Israel.
Right.
And for so many reasons, that is so important in how the United States reflects power. And I think the last administration sort of lost the plot there. Because what we're seeing today with the Houthis, how old is this? This is 1.5 years old. It is unbelievable. And we've been talking about this time and again. It is unbelievable that the United States just let the Houthis change the global commerce prices of shipping, freedom of navigation, the Egyptian economy, which should be the ones screaming, jumping out of their beds every morning saying, how can that be? How can that be? And it's just happening.
On the Houthi part, before everybody started becoming experts in this, or sprouting, out of thin air, many became experts in the last 15 months, or actually less, let's say half a year. The Houthis have been operational in Yemen for a very long time. And I remember in the early 2000s, I had the opportunity to really focus on the Yemeni file. And for various reasons, we won't go into it here, but nonetheless, the Houthis at the time, they were on the side of America, ironically. They operated on behalf of the Americans. Why? Because they had a common enemy that is called Al-Qaeda, right? So this small northern Yemeni tribe that operated against the Saudis, which is also Wahhabism, Salafism in different forms. It was fighting with them, which a small Shiite group there. And then they were fighting the southern clans and the southeastern clans, for that matter, which Al-Qaeda was very active and still is, by the way. It's considered to be the most violent of all of the Al-Qaeda offshoots, specifically in the region. And therefore, they knew their American counterparts. They are fully aware. Abdul Malik al-Houthi now is this considered to be a muhtar, the leader, and providing his statements and highlighting, various projections for the future. But naturally, he grew up as a boy and a young man, looking at his elders dealing with the Americans. So this is quite interesting to see how everything shifted. The anti-American rhetoric sprouted a lot faster when the Houthis were confronted by a Saudi-led coalition to basically safeguard not freedom of navigation per se, but to safeguard their energy products, which was an American interest. And the Saudis are naturally an American ally or partner, to be more exact. And within that context, the Houthis started to seek for alternative options. Who were the first ones to heed that call? The Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps of the Islamic Republic of Iran, the Chinese, the Russians. These relations have been very deep since the let's say 2011, give or take. So you see a certain process evolving there, and a small organization granting aid from the rivals of the United States being pushed forward, and then the United States granting the Saudis the capacity to fight back with tools and intelligence and munitions. And on the last month of the Trump administration, during his previous administration, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo at the time designated the Houthis as a foreign terrorist organization. Less than a month later, suddenly we see Antony Blinken, the new top diplomat of the Biden administration, revoking, canceling this, and saying, they're not a terrorist organization. Why? Because the United Nations said that if they would sanction them, it would harm all Yemenis, and it would be collective punishment, and therefore the United States cannot designate them terrorists, irrespective of what they do. And then you realize to what degree this international institution is corrupt. And it operates in a fashion that favors the Chinese bloc, the Russian bloc, the Iranian bloc, at the expense of the United States, which is its biggest funder. And that didn't make any sense at the time. And then we saw the Saudis and the Emiratis starting to question, do we really want to go with the Americans? Aren't the Chinese more credible? We know they're bad actors, but we can deal with them. We can walk between the raindrops, so to speak. And they decided to wait out, of course, the Biden administration as much as possible. And you see during that time, the government of Abd Rabbu Mansur Hadi of Yemen collapse. You see the different evolutions in which the tribes that were under the government, the internationally recognized government, not that of the Houthis, basically tribes started saying, okay, please don't annihilate us, as the Houthis were advancing, coming to terms in a negotiation with the Houthis, giving them hostages, receiving assurances, and then receiving also pledges of financial and other tools to preserve their tribal construct. And you see more and more tribes joining the Houthis and suddenly becoming this mega army that can bring hundreds of thousands to the streets. Why? Because if one of those tribes does not listen, they're children of the leaders and some of the other smaller tribes that are attached to him will be murdered by the Houthis. So there is a complexity here of dealing both from the air as well as from the tribal, the small tribal complexities of the internal question to understand how to defeat this organization, which goes under the banner of Ansar Allah, that has the motto of death to America, death to Israel, victory for Islam, curse the Jews, which they adopted from the Islamic Revolutionary Guards, which is also their motto. And then they go and they disrupt freedom of navigation, except for whose? China, Russia, Iran, and other bad actors in that axis of anti-Western aspirations. How do you see that?
It smells like the whiff of 1979 just all over again, right? In a new location, right? Back in 1979, the
Islamic
Revolution. United States and Great Britain before that tried to sort of design Iranian oil refineries, British BP. And it turned out, 2 decades later, that the Iranians started to boil from within, and the Islamic Revolution, 1979. And it's sort of a cut and paste or copy paste, if you will. This time, the IRGC from the Iranians are using global geopolitics and the world divide, the BRICS, right? The states, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and we're using this overall global other side of the world, trying to create leverage over the Western economy dominated by the dollar and the United States. This is what we're seeing. And countries are crumbling under this global quarrel, if you will, between these two blocks.
But BRICS, if I really go into the substance of BRICS, you have India and China. I mean,
it's a transactional block. It's not a real block. It's not the Western like-minded alliance, let's call it.
But it doesn't really have any true substance to it.
I agree. But still, if you look at what's happening in the Horn of Africa, East Africa, and you're looking at Yemen, each country, each nation uses its forms of national power and location on the globe, right? The Yemenis, what do they have? They have a capacity to shoot ballistic missiles. Like, how did we even get there?
Well, Iran.
That's it. I
Right.
mean, it's absolutely amazing that this very, very poor country has famine, children dying from hunger, and just like anything Iran touches, it turns out to missiles, tunnels, or threat on freedom of navigation. It's all bad acting. And that is why you need to deal with it when it starts. That's the common motto. And if you want to deal with it when it starts, you have to be very consistent with your foreign policy. The American foreign policy between the administrations was so inconsistent. And this inconsistency, it develops and it blows up in our faces, basically. The first Trump administration, then you get the Democrats, then you get the second. I mean, oh my God. Think about how, from President Obama, everything it did in Egypt and North Africa, the whole Arab Spring, which turned out to a terrible winter. This is really something people, our audience, are, they have to understand. The world, spreading democracy as democracy is not necessarily a good thing for the
you
world.
Pointed out at the beginning of today's edition, economy, diplomacy, and military is the three tools of power projection by
Any
states.
nation. Yeah, states.
Right? Culture can be transactional to a certain degree. It can be very significant in order to establish spheres of influence.
Correct.
Which is a soft power tool, but it doesn't necessarily project actual power. It's still soft power, and therefore it's very amendable. The Japanese in the past, when Europe went and did business around the world during colonial times, one of their prerequisites for the local leaders was allowing missionaries to go and preach the gospel to the various tribes and peoples. And then the Japanese at some point said, we don't accept it. The only country in the world that was willing at that point to say, okay, so we'll just do business, was the Netherlands. Okay, the rest, Britain and the others, said, no, we won't accept that. Same for Islamic countries. The Islamic countries don't even ask. When they go and do business somewhere, they demand mosques. And according to the Quran, wherever there is a mosque, it remains Islamic for eternity. So they're able to expand and become that way. And you hear the speeches of the Queen of Jordan during the Ramadan coming out and speaking about how magnificent it is that Jordan has established new mosques in the United States and in Europe and elsewhere, because this will remain Islamic forever. So there is that perception of being to expand and using the religious and cultural aspects for expansionism. Now, we don't have very much time left. And my question is, with the current climate in Israel, okay, of still being at war, do you see this going through 2025 and beyond, 2025 into 26? Is this a long war, what we're experiencing right now?
It is, because what we're seeing now is a complete change of some very basic constructs and foundations of how the region works. We talk a lot about Sykes-Picot, right? About how the region, how nations were created in the Middle East, and how the Middle East actually works cross-border, cross Sykes-Picot borders, the tribal aspects of the Middle East. And it is a very tribal region and not a very liberal region. So the tribal allegiance is something that we need to bear in mind very much when we look into how we are creating these new orders. Syria has evaporated, and it is now pulled to many directions, from the Russian interests, which we spoke about on the Western side, to the Turkish interests, expansion interests as well, that are pushing from the north, to the Iraqis that need something, to the Kurds in the northeast of Syria, to the Druze in the south, to Israel's interests, to the Lebanese country as a country at all, with all its factions. It is a very sensitive, it's going to be a very sensitive decade, I think. We're entering a point in time that the Middle East, with the other nations that are sort of asking themselves, what is our future vis-a-vis what are our forms of national power, being Saudi Arabia, Egypt, the countries that were leaning on oil export for decades and decades, but understanding that it's not going to stay forever. How are they shaping their future? And we're seeing new leaders sort of emerging. And Israel and the United States, Israel being, again, the anvil of the United States in the region, will have to sort of figure out this new strategy for the long term, and using all forms of national power from the United States, through Israel, through the allies, through the Abraham Accords, expanding them in order to restabilize the region. And sadly, because of these extreme, that we let these extreme factions and elements grow, extreme Islamic, whether Sunni or Shiite extreme, we will have to deal with them, both sides.
Sooner than later.
Sooner than later.
Well, General Rosen, thank you so very much for coming today. It's been a pleasure. And I'd like to thank all of you at home as well, and highlight also that TV7 Israel is a donation-based organization, a ministry. We have a 501c3 in the United States, as well as a nonprofit in Europe, in Finland, Helsinki. And I'd like to encourage you to support our operations, since we are exclusively reliant on your donations and support. And therefore, please go to our website at www.tv7israelnews.com, where you'll be able to donate. So please do. For me here in Jerusalem, until our next edition, I'll immediately also say Shavua Tov, a good week to you all at home. And until our next edition, Shalom.